Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Today, as always, I'm joined by our co-host and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. We're going to be talking about the recently completed trade deadline for your Houston Rockets. Paulo, I'm guessing you're feeling pretty good, by and large, both from a Brooklyn perspective, and the Rockets own the Nets picks through 2027, so we're always looking out for the Nets. And this week they traded Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. And from a Houston perspective, trading Eric Gordon for first-round value and also getting a couple of decent second-round assets for Garrison Matthews and Bruno Fernando. It's been a pretty good week, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could realistically not have expected anything better for the Rockets. I mean, we were kind of led to believe by reports by Fagan, by Kelly Rico, earlier in the week that there wasn't going to be a lot of, movement. That it wasn't expected that KD was going to get traded, and then all of a sudden, basically, all of the chips fall the Rockets' way. So from a general perspective, it's great. We finally got the Nets to blow up. Although, as we record this podcast, they are currently beating the Sixers, and they beat whoever it was in their first game without
They
KD.
beat the Bulls the other night. What I will say on that front, by the way, remember when the Rockets traded Harden in January 2021? They actually reeled off 6 straight wins and 7 of 8 right after the trade. And it took until Christian Wood turned his ankle, and that cost him a couple of months before things really, really went south. So I would just note that there's often sort of a rallying effect for the guys that are left behind, or in this case, not all the guys that were left behind. It's also the spare parts that they acquired in those trades. People are counting them out. So in the short term, there's actually a lot of precedent for teams sort of rallying around something like this, especially if they're well coached, which I think the Nets are with Jacque Vaughn.
Yeah, and once things start to go sideways the first time around, I'm sure it'll go sideways. And as well, they have a lot of 3-and-D wings, as everyone says. Usually those are more valuable when you have a lead creator, and they do kind of have a lead creator. Like they're playing bigger roles than what they're supposed to on a good team. But Dinwiddie and Cam Thomas are pretty good. It'll be interesting if injuries happen, and if they get unlucky and the injury and an injury happens to either, I don't know, Nick Claxton or one of the lead guards that they're currently rostering. It'll be really hard because none of those guys can create by themselves. And we know, the Rockets themselves are a team that they have a lot of lead creators, but they're not, proven in the NBA. They're not quite good yet, but and they have a lot of 3-and-D wings, and we can tell that guys like Tyrese, they're going to be good players. They just don't look as good, with worse creators around them.
The one thing I would say about the Nets is that I think their margin of error is so much smaller now. And in a short sample, especially the emotions of everything that happened, then they may rally around this. But the longer that this plays out, I think the more and more the talent is going to set in. And I'm going to use the Rockets example post-Harden. That team was not without talent. John Wall, Eric Gordon, Victor Oladipo, PJ Tucker, Christian Wood, they had legitimate talent. There just was not that star to stir the drink. Christian Wood was the closest thing to that on that team. And then, of course, it took his injury and things went, you went from winning 6 in a row and 7 of 8 to losing 20 straight games almost overnight. It was wild how quickly things shifted in that season. And I think that's what happens when you lose a superstar like Kevin Durant. I made the argument the other day on Twitter that with the Nets, basically what's happened, their floor is significantly lower without KD. And someone responded to that saying, well, isn't it the ceiling? And my response to that, well, it's both. Certainly the ceiling is lower in the sense that they're no longer capable of winning a championship. I think everyone will concede that, even the most diehard Nets homers out there. But the floor is also lower, and that's important if you own all their draft assets, which the Rockets do, either direct pick conveyances or swaps through 2027, because without Kevin Durant, it's so easy for things to fall apart. You have a couple of injuries, the chemistry goes sideways, whatever it may be, you don't have that glue to bring the team together. Also, from a team building perspective, having a guy like Kevin Durant, a guy of that stature, it's basically a magnet to qualified players all around the league. Guys like KD and LeBron have qualified veterans that know how to win, wanting to sign for cheap all the time, either just to play with them, to bolster their value. They're typically in a good market, which Brooklyn certainly is. There's all sorts of reasons that having Kevin Durant makes it really, really difficult to bottom out. And the counter to that, well, what if, like what happened with the Warriors a couple of years ago, he tears an Achilles, something crazy like that happens? I mean, it's possible, but number one, you certainly don't want to plan around that. And secondly, even if it does happen, it may not happen in training camp or in October or November. And then even if it does in one of these seasons that you own or control their draft pick, it may not matter because a lot of the results are already baked in. Take what happened at this deadline, in which basically in a week, the Nets went from a legitimate contender or close to it to basically blown up, at least from the standpoint of their two superstars and any chance of a title. And yet, from the standpoint of the Rockets, there's almost nothing, especially with this being a swap pick, that it can do to influence this year's pick because they've already won too many games. It's too late in the season, even if they somehow lost every game the rest of the way. And so when people say things like, well, is the floor higher because they're less dependent on a star, there's more depth, I can see why you might superficially think that. However, in the way that it actually plays out, I think the floor is a lot lower, in addition to the ceiling being lower. The ceiling being lower is obvious, but the floor is lower as well. And over the course of 4 or 5 years, then I think the odds are pretty good that one of those years, the Nets may have, an ill-timed injury or two, the chemistry goes sideways, for whatever reason, the mix just isn't right, and you don't have that guy, that central figure like Kevin Durant, to sort of bring everything together and salvage it. Because every NBA team faces adversity at one point or another, and typically the reason the elite, the star-led teams survive that is because they have one or two players that can just sort of lead, command the respect to bring everything together. Now the Nets don't have that. It doesn't mean the Nets are going to be terrible every single game. No, absolutely not. There's a lot of talented players on that roster. But I think especially when we're talking about 4 or 5 years of draft assets, I think the odds are pretty good that one of those years that things may go sideways and now you don't have a Durant or Kyrie to bring things together, right?
Yeah, I agree. I also think that their floor was already high without KD because their team was really deep. The depth that they gained, that usually is part of what brings the floor higher up when you lose a star. They are better than the depth that they had before, but you're also losing a lot of good depth that you had that is just useless right now. So it's not a coincidence that without KD, the Nets were still a respectable team, and now they're just that respectable team with some upgraded pieces because KD was hurt before any. Moving on to the actual trade, I'm actually impressed that the Suns didn't have to give up DeAndre Ayton. I'm surprised that they didn't have to give all of the swaps as well. This is one of those scenarios where, well, you might argue that if you compare this to the James Harden trade, Harden was younger, and so he should have been worth more from that perspective. But then again, usually when you're trading a star as big as KD or Harden, you're basically getting everything the other team has to give. They're worth more, and the other team would give up more if they had more to give. And so usually that's what happens. But the other team just gets completely ran out of assets. That's not what happened. They got the 4 first-round picks, correct. They got 1 swap, but they didn't get the other 3 swaps, which is interesting. It might even play out that they don't matter. For example, the Rocket swaps so far haven't mattered. But it's still interesting that they didn't manage to get it all. And I also think it's interesting that they didn't make any other moves with the assets that they got, because it seems like they want to be at least decent, and they want to be in a position where they can trade for a star if that star is available. And I would argue that it's going to be really hard for them to trade for a star going forward, just because the stars usually want to play with each other, and usually, unless you're like Luka Doncic or that type of heliocentric player, just being the lone star on a team isn't as appealing. You usually want some help, and so I think the market for Brooklyn will actually be guys that haven't gotten a star role on their current teams that are looking for a place like that. Guys like, I mean, obviously not to that extent, but Cam Reddish wanted to leave the Hawks because he wanted a bigger role. I could see, for example, I don't think he's the type of guy to do that, but I think Tyrese Maxey could be a guy who is currently on a team where he's overshadowed by two other stars, but he has star potential himself, and maybe he wants to prove himself as a max player. He could be a guy that leverages his position later on in his rookie deal if the Sixers aren't willing to max him out, because I think we've seen enough from Tyrese Maxey to see that he's a potential max player, but it's hard to pay a max to a guy if he's not the main option or the second option. And even if he is putting up numbers that might be worthy of a max, it's always hard. This to say that going forward, the outlook of the Nets, it's not a lot of people countered that Rockets fans were celebrating too early by saying, "Oh, I think the Nets are still going to be decent." My point is, the Nets were always going to be decent. They have no incentive. I mean, they had earlier in the year if they wanted to tank for this 1 year, but with a year coming up after this one, where they just lose their pick outright unprotected, they have no incentive to be bad. So they're always going to try to be as good as they can, and as a Rockets fan, you can still celebrate the KD trade even if the Nets aren't going to be the worst team in the league, because they are worse than they were before, and so that's an increase in value. And they might not. You might even argue that they're not as volatile, but that doesn't matter. They are objectively a worse team.
Yeah.
And they were never going to be. It's important to realize nowadays in the NBA, and this is kind of a recent trend, but since the Rockets have been actually rebuilding, unless I just haven't paid attention beforehand, it seems like more teams are being more objective when it comes to the path that they want to take. Teams are turning to tanking earlier. Rebuilding teams, when they're ready to start, they're just going, you know what, let's just bottom out faster than usual. You could list 5 or 6 teams this year who are just going to legit tank. And so it's going to be actually really hard for a team who doesn't want to tank to be any worse than the 6th worst team in the league, for example, in any given year, because as teams get out of that position, other teams will fall into it. And so it's basically a revolving door. And now that the league's okay with, or not okay with, but it's been normalized to tank. The Nets were never going to be worse than the 6th or 7th team in the league, just because they're going to try and win. And whatever players they have, whenever they face the teams that are trying to lose, they're going to win because the other teams want to lose harder. So I think this is still jackpot for the Rockets, jackpot for Rafael Stone. This is the best that could have happened. If you asked anyone at the time the trade was made, if they would be happy with an outcome where the Nets blow up and have literally 0 of their stars.
Barely over 2 years since the trade.
Yeah, but let's not even count this year. Let's be nice and not count this year, because they are probably going to be a playoff team. Not counting this year. If you gave me the option, hey, in 3 years the Nets are blowing up, I would have shaken your hand on the spot
for sure.
And so you can just celebrate that they're worse. This is really good for the Rockets.
Yeah.
I also don't think that, and a lot of people have been bringing this up, I also don't think this means they should rush to trade the Nets picks right away, because some front office is going to overreact to KD being traded. Listen, guys, we are people on Twitter, and we can see that perhaps the picks might be overvalued. If we are seeing that, everybody else in the league is also seeing that the picks might be overvalued, I think.
Well, here's my case for it. And first, I will preface by saying that the Rockets should engage the Nets this summer. In fact, I heard they checked in with them a couple of times this week. It's smart to do that when the reality, as we laid out in our Kevin Durant pod last week, reacting to the Kyrie Irving trade, and of course talking about the fact that KD could come next. Ultimately, he did come next. We talked about the picks that the Rockets own from Brooklyn are disproportionately valuable to the Nets, because ultimately to the Nets, it's about optionality. It's about giving them multiple paths. And if they get those picks back, then if things don't work out with their current, I suppose, quasi rebuild or pursuing a next star, then having those picks, it gives them a fail safe. And so if the Nets want to overpay based on the fact that they're more valuable, those picks to them than to the Rockets or any other team, then sure, you should be open to that. I do think the Rockets will engage them again this summer. Could the Rockets be interested in Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson? Wouldn't surprise me. You certainly should poke around and see what happens. And ultimately, I don't think making a deal this week was realistic at all. I think with so much turnover in Brooklyn, the Nets just want to hit the pause button and just get to the offseason and then take stock of where they are, see what happens the rest of this year in the playoffs, and then take a deeper look over the offseason and think about what their plan is. So the Rockets could re-engage the Nets. That's absolutely possible. However, if I'm the Rockets, I'm certainly not desperate to move those picks. If anything, and I say this as someone who in the past has said, yeah, the Rockets should consider making a deal because there is more value to the present. If you bring in a difference maker currently, then you can help the current team. And clearly there are some bad habits with your prospects like Jalen Green, Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Şengün that you would like to improve, that having, if not a star, just a proven player could help you in your development with the current group. And I know it's a backseat. We're not talking about the team, which as we record, they're still worst record in the league, 13-43. They've lost 5 straight games. They have looked better the last 2 games, but just a couple of heartbreakers, both with 0.3 seconds left, the lob to Jimmy Butler and the controversial foul on Eric Gordon against De'Aaron Fox. We'll actually talk next week about the micro of the Rockets. When we get to the All-Star break, we'll talk more about what's been going on in these recent games and some of the day-to-day stuff. This, of course, is our big picture episode. And so to tie it back into the Nets, sure, you could absolutely make a case that if you can get some certainty in the present to help this group, then it's worth exploring. But we're at a point now in which there's only 25 games left to play in this season. And as I explained, the value of that certainty, this year you'd have to weigh it against any detrimental impact to your lottery odds as well. And then when we get to this summer, you're going to have up to $60 million in cap space. And so the Rockets should be able to bring in those types of players that we're talking about, the high floor certainty type guys. Even if it's not a star like James Harden, you'll definitely bring in some proven difference makers that can sort of fill that role anyway. So you don't need to desperately move these picks to do so at this stage. Again, there's only 25 games left to play in this season, and then you're going to shift pretty quickly into something more of a, if not contending mode, definitely trying to win mode. So in terms of the Rockets and these picks from the Nets and what that means, what I will say is that over a 4-year period that the Nets don't have a star, I think the odds are pretty good that in one of those years, things are going to go sideways. They may not bottom out the way the Warriors did a couple of years ago. I think that's the example everybody thinks of when, a team sees everything go wrong. But when you don't have a superstar anymore, it doesn't take much, be it a couple of ill-timed injuries, the chemistry, as we talked about earlier, and before you know it, things can go off the rails. And combine that with the flattened lottery odds, I think the odds are pretty good that in one of those 4 years, you can get at least, I'd say, a mid-lottery asset, which is a very high upside guy. And you're at a point now, maybe it changes this offseason, but you have a lot of prospects you like, but Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, Alperen Şengün, none of them are sure things to hit at an all-star level. We'll see what happens with the lottery. Does the 27% chance activate that you get Victor or Scoot? I hope it does. Do you get James Harden in free agency? Although even if you do, he'd be 34 years old. So I'm not sure exactly how he fits into the calculus of this. The fact is, there's a much easier path to one of those picks becoming an elite asset. And if you go into this summer feeling, you won't feel terrible, but let's say none of the current prospects shows you anything dramatically different over the last 25 games. Maybe Jalen goes on a tear to close the season like he did last year, and we're thinking about him differently. But again, we're recording this in early February. We're doing this based on what we know at this time. So if that doesn't happen and you don't get a Victor or Scoot, and we'll see what happens in free agency, then there may be value in keeping those picks and ultimately going for upside that you may need in a quality over quantity league. That to me, you could always argue it to an extent, but when they had Kevin Durant, I wasn't sure if the upside was quite there to always justify it. Now there is more upside, in my opinion. And so based on that, not saying I wouldn't move those picks, but to me, there's more of a compelling case. The need for certainty is not quite as high because you're almost to the summer that you have all this cap room anyway. And now the upside long term is higher. Again, I'm not saying it's a given either way. It's sort of a complex picture. You see what happens the rest of this year. You see what happens in the lottery. You see what happens in free agency. Maybe, if you get Victor or Scoot or you get a star in free agency or by trade, your talent advantage is so overwhelming that the appeal of dealing those picks for something more certain rises again. But at this point, with the upside rising, I'm actually going a little bit the other way, as you were saying. I've seen the narratives on Twitter that maybe you should consider now, striking while the iron is hot. I'm not so sure. Over the course of 4 years, I can't say exactly when in those 4 years, but I think the odds are pretty good that there's going to be 1 year in there where things don't go right for the Nets. And depending on what happens this offseason, if you're the Rockets, it may make more sense to gamble on the upside of that asset. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I think the Rockets are at a point where they have a lot of prospects. If you are going to make a trade, a consolidation trade, if possible, if at all possible, you should try to replace as many picks with prospects. Mostly because, I mean, we've made this argument over and over again. Picks are more fluid. The Rockets only have one pick in next year's draft. So it's not one of those scenarios where you have 3 picks coming in and whatever. The Rockets have one pick, not in the next draft. I mean, the one before, the one afterwards, when they're trying to compete from the Nets. They don't have their own pick that goes to OKC, unless they're top 4, of course. So if I'm bringing a consolidation trade, I'm trying to make as much of it possible be around guys like Josh Christopher, Usman Garuba, perhaps KJ Martin, depending on who you're bringing in as a vet. So if that's just my take on a consolidation trade. I'm not rushing to move the picks. If I can see a deal that makes sense now, yes. And I will say that a deal that makes sense now might not be Mikal Bridges for me. Mostly
Right, that's what I'm getting
because
at. Yeah, unless you're getting a sweetheart deal, the certainty of a guy like Bridges may not be as attractive of a selling point anymore.
yeah, and it's not even that much about it's about the certainty, but not only about the certainty. It's just an archetype type thing. It depends
Okay,
on who you
fair.
it depends on who you draft, but Mikal Bridges is a guy that you can bring in and he'll improve your team. But you've got a lot of guys of his archetype already on the team that are good and that I think they're certifiably good. I think Darison is going to be certifiably good. I think KJ Martin is certifiably good right now if you put them on a better team. I would if I'm spending my prime assets that I have right now, which in my opinion would be the Nets picks, perhaps one of the big guys we have on the team right now. I would be trying to go for a star, or I would hold out for a star. I think there's a world where if Boston's not confident that they can retain Brown after next year because he's guaranteed to hit free agency, I think there's a very real scenario where they reach the deadline and if they're not in prime contenders status, that they move Brown so they don't risk losing him in free agency, for example. Opportunities like these shake free basically every year. And the Nets picks are at this point after next year's draft are basically only there to replace the picks that the Rockets owe to the Thunder with a +1 on a swap, I think, at the end of the cycle, because the Rockets picks to the Thunder end in 2026,
right?
And the Nets end in 2027. So if you trade the Nets picks off for a guy like Mikal Bridges, you now don't have a package anymore for a star that might take free.
And then the Stepien rule comes into play too.
Yeah, because of the Stepien rule, you just don't have a package with just the later picks after you owe the picks to the Thunder past 2026. So there's value in holding on to the picks in the case that a star that you are interested in takes free, so you can have a competitive offer. Just a quick of other things about the Nets situation. The Nets have been over the past few years a team that has paid a lot of tax. I would be really surprised if the Nets owner Gotsai is willing to continue paying tax for a team that's clearly not a contender anymore. Considering what they have paid and considering that there have been decisions along the way where they have shied away from re-signing guys. The guy that is just traded before, Spencer Dinwiddie, they didn't pay him after the James Harden trade. He was coming off an injury, to be fair, but they knew what they had there, and they had Harden, Kyrie, and KD, and they let him they let him leave in free agency for nothing. So I don't think the Nets are the Warriors where they will be willing to pay God knows how much tax in a year where they're not contending, like the Warriors did when they got James Wiseman. And the last one thing that I will say, it was reported that the Rockets had interest in both Cam Johnson and Mikal Bridges. The report was by Kelly Eco, during the frenzy of the trade deadline. It just didn't. I'm not sure if this was a part. I'm sure actually that it was a part of the thinking. Cam Johnson is a restricted free agent next year. If you're wanting to go after a guy like that, and this also takes away from the motivation to trade for Mikal Bridges, if you're wanting to go after a guy like that, and I just told you that the Nets are going to have tax issues, very real tax issues, on a team that's not going to be contending next year, you're in a position of power to go out and use your cap space to sign a guy like Cam Johnson, because it's
Yes.
unlikely that the Nets would just match the offer. So just spending assets on training for them is not the most, or having done so in the last deadline was not the correct way of approaching it, in my opinion.
Yeah, and as we transition now from the Nets to more Rocket-centric discussion, one of the interesting things about this deadline was the ripple effects that moves like this KD trade, of course, the Kyrie one before it, set in motion so many other deals around the league. And I give Rafael Stone a lot of credit for, I think, adjusting to the marketplace. I don't think that he was lying when he leaked to the likes of Jonathan Fagan and Kelly Iko that it wasn't likely that anything significant would happen on deadline day. No, I think the market just changed, especially after the Kevin Durant deal, which struck at midnight Houston time, Wednesday night / Thursday morning. And I think when you see teams like the Suns and the Mavs making those types of moves in the Western Conference, that if you're a team like the Clippers that has Kawhi and PG now in their 30s, a clear incentive to win now, it makes it all the more difficult to sit out and not try to make moves to upgrade your team as well. So it turned into more of a seller's market. There aren't that many sellers right now because with the play-in tournament, there really aren't that many teams that are truly out of the mix. The Rockets are a rare exception where they are, and I think Rafael Stone took advantage of that. I think that was part of the thinking in terms of Eric Gordon becoming more available on deadline day. I don't think that the Rockets caved. Well, certainly they didn't. You had people talking in the days leading up, would the Rockets end up having to buy him out or Gordon trying to force a buyout? Not at all. They end up getting legit first round value with a pick right now that looks like it's going to be, middle of the first round, perhaps. I think that's a really valuable pick swap. And I think that's what you want in a rebuild, your GM to be opportunistic. I think they were when it comes to the Eric Gordon trade. And again, I think it is sort of an offshoot of what we've been talking about with the Nets and the KD trade and the way that influenced the market. And the other part of the EG deal that I think speaks well to Rafael Stone, I love the emphasis on swaps and the creativity. We've actually seen them do this before with Victor Oladipo a couple of years ago when they moved him to Miami. I know when we had our Rafael Stone pod, so you graded Oladipo an F, but the reason you were harsh, it wasn't just about the trade, it was about the whole Oladipo experience. And clearly, I think when they got Oladipo in the Harden deal, I think it's fair to say they didn't properly weight his injury risk. So yeah, if you're looking at it through that prism, that's completely fair. I graded it more moderately because while it didn't work out, that swap didn't really lead to anything. They didn't use it. Ultimately, Brooklyn bottomed out or somewhat bottomed out a year ago. They barely made the playoffs, but middle of first round, pick 17, you got Tari Eason from that. The Rockets at the time saw a Brooklyn team that was loaded, and in the late 20s at the 2021 deadline, Miami was about 17, 18. If you remember, they actually finished at 18 because that's where the Rockets would have, because of the pick swap, the convoluted one with Oklahoma City, that's where they would have fallen to if they didn't get into the lottery, which they did to get Jalen Green. And so they thought it'd move them up about 10 spots with the same type of deal. Now, because Oladipo wasn't quite the player that Eric Gordon currently is, that swap was lottery protected, whereas this one for Eric Gordon, the Rockets are in a better negotiating position and it's only top 6 protected, so there is more upside to it. But I think the thinking is the same, and that the likely scenario is you'll move up 10 spots. And the one 2 years ago, it didn't work out. But again, I thought the thought process was sound. That's why I didn't grade the Oladipo trade itself as, a bust. I see what they were thinking. It could have worked out. And in that case, even though the swap didn't activate, in some ways they sort of protected themselves because they knew that, hey, if this doesn't activate, now Miami did end up being a little better than expected last year, but it was also, hey, if it doesn't activate, then there's a decent chance that Brooklyn's going to be worse than expected. And if that's the case, then we're covered anyway because we're going to get a better than expected asset from the Nets pick, which they did in Tari Eason, who looks like a very good prospect right now. So that's why that particular deal, even though it didn't work out, sometimes it's not about the result. You also have to look at the process. And I thought the process of that deal was pretty good. And I think they applied it to this deal. They were just in a slightly better negotiating position, which is the seller's market and also Gordon being a better player. That's how they got lighter protections, just top 6. And so I'm excited. The Bucks are really good. That pick would have been 28, 29, and the pick swap that allows them to move up from 28 to 18, that's a real asset. Now, of course, they got salary filler as well. Danny Green from the Grizzlies, it's a 3-team deal. Also, John Wall, who's going to be waived. We'll see about Green. Maybe Green's a veteran influence, a 3-and-D guy. You can talk about that if you want, Paolo. But clearly, the prime asset is the pick swap, going from the Bucks to the Clippers, which right now would push you up from about 28 to 18 or so. That's a real asset, and I love the creativity to, I guess, number one, adjust to the market, and secondly, to really emphasize the swaps. I think that's super important because in this NBA market, where even guys like Rudy Gobert, who's a very good player but certainly not a great one, got 4 first-round picks last offseason. It's been reported that Mikal Bridges was offered, or the Nets were offered 4 first-round picks from the Grizzlies for him. If guys like that are in the very good but not great tier are getting that many first-round picks, then you're going to be entering a landscape where a lot of teams, because of the stepping rule that you can't be without consecutive first-round picks or without first-round picks in consecutive years, you can get around it if you own another team's pick. There's going to be a lot of teams that can't make the offers that we're used to in terms of, you have a player you're trying to sell off, and typically they might go for a first-round pick. Well, there's a lot of teams that are going to be cashed out of first-round picks that just can't trade them even if they want to.
Like the Clippers.
Yes, the way to get around that, because the Clippers are for the foreseeable future cashed out because they sent them all to Oklahoma City in the Paul George trade from 2019. So by doing this, the swap is the workaround. It's legit a first-round asset. The other benefit now, too, is that, we did the swap for Oladipo. It's for the next year. So inevitably, when we're talking about a future season, things can change. Whereas this season, so much of the results, nearly 70%, are already baked in. So it's much more likely to have value. That's another perk as well that I think comes from the Rockets and Gordon being in a stronger negotiating position. But just in general, I really like the fundamental principle because that's how you adjust to the market. There's not going to be as many first-round picks to go around, so you need to get that first-round value in other ways. The swap is that. And in the case of the Rockets, who already have a pretty deep roster, I guess, number one, it addresses the lack of first-round value because the Clippers, as you laid out, are a team that couldn't directly trade a first-round pick. The other, or at least in the foreseeable future, they could if you talk about like 2028 and beyond, but who knows what the value of that is or if the Clippers would deal that. The other thing that comes into play with this situation, it just gives you a much better, I guess, position to negotiate from in the future. This is a template that you can use for future deals when you have these types of assets out there. I know the Rockets, they're not going to be bottoming out in a year from now. They're going to be trying to win, but you always have veterans that for one reason or another, maybe their contract is running out. This is the kind of thing that gives you hope that they will figure something out. And in this case, because of the construct of the Rockets roster, they didn't want a late first round pick anyway, even if that was out there. They would want to consolidate. So in addition to getting around the stepping rule and getting a first round asset anyway, the Rockets also addressed their need to consolidate by, instead of getting a late first round pick and then maybe trying to trade that pick with the Milwaukee pick into something in the middle of the first round. This is 2 birds with 1 stone. You just did it right there, and you moved into what's likely, very likely, I know there's still 25 games left, but likely to be in the middle of the first round. So it checked a lot of boxes, but above all else, I just love the creativity because, again, I think it's just going to be an increasing trend in the NBA. There's less first-round picks to go around, and so these swaps are basically the workaround to still get the traditional first-round value, even if a team you're negotiating with may not have a first-round pick available to trade.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That was actually the point I was about to make. It's the Rockets didn't want to do first-round picks, and a way of settling would have been to getting that second first round pick and either trading it further into the future or combining the 2 picks to trade up. A lot of people look at this trade up, which right now is from pick 29 to pick 18, so 11 spots. To trade 11 spots in the first round, you need 2 late first round picks. So basically what they did is they, as you said, 2 birds, 1 stone. They basically got the second first round pick and immediately it's imagine this, it's the same thing as if they got pick 28 from Denver for Eric Gordon, or which is in Charlotte right now, and they combined 28 and 29 to trade up to 18, which is there's some opportunity cost involved in that because it's not guaranteed that any team in the range from 14 through 20 is going to want to trade back to take 2 guys. There's very few teams in the NBA right now that would be in the business of trading 1 good first round pick for 2 worse first round picks. Usually the teams that would do that are teams that are, just starting a rebuild and have a lot of playing time to go around. Perhaps someone like Utah, if they decide to blow it up going into next season, for example. Utah might have done it, but Utah doesn't have a pick in that range. And maybe if Portland blows it up, maybe they will do it. They have a pick in that range, but that demands that they will trade Damian Lillard, for example. It's just I actually think, and I think this is a hot take for some people that might be listening. I actually think that the Rockets ended up getting better off by holding on to Eric Gordon for another year than they would have done if they had traded him back then for,
Yeah.
say, pick 25.
Yeah, it's a win for Rafael Stone, and that's a big deal because we've heard, asset management criticized a lot in recent weeks, and Eric Gordon was one of the leading reasons for that. People wondering, should you have dealt him earlier? From where I'm sitting, it looks like they did just as well, if not better. So
I think they did better
maybe you
because
argue he got a little bit lucky because with the KD trade moved the market, but the bottom line, it's a win for Rafael Stone.
look at the draft from last year. Let's say it's the Sixers pick right now. Let's say it's 23, which is on the higher end of picks. If you want to pick it up from the Rockets' standpoint, for example, the Rockets got Ty Washington at 29. If you combined David Roddy and Ty Washington, I'm not sure you could get pick 18 in this year's draft. Just because it's part of it is the fact that you drive the car out of the store. The other thing is usually usually when it comes to in draft trades, it's around a guy that the team wants falling there. And if there's something that we've seen in the last few drafts is there's always someone falling. Tari Eason was someone that fell. AJ Griffin was someone that fell. Front officers, a lot of guys are falling in recent years, which makes it less likely that a team in a spot like what the Clippers pick is right now at 18 makes it less likely that they want to trade because pick 18 is right after the lottery. That's the prime position to get a guy that was supposed to go lottery that for some reason is falling. Call it Tari Eason at 17. Call it AJ Griffin at 16. This is always happening in recent drafts, and so it's actually a fairly hard range to trade into.
And Rafael Stone mentioned in his press conference, by the way, that he also thought it could improve the trade value of that pick as well, probably for that same reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the other thing that I was going to mention is the protection part. To me, it's kind of irrelevant, and I'll get into that as well. So the way that pick works is
I understand because the only way that it would kick in would be if they actually win the lottery, one of those 4 picks. But relative to the Oladipo trade, that's what I was stressing, because if they got the same protection, which is lottery protection of Oladipo, then you'd have to sweat them out losing the play-in tournament. Whereas this, you're covered. Basically, you're covered unless like a 5% chance something crazy happens and they win the lottery, right?
No, versus the Oladipo trade, absolutely. And it not being lottery protected to me is a huge deal.
Yes.
What I'm saying doesn't make much of a difference is because the first report was that it was top 9 and then it became top 6.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying there.
Yeah, that difference is basically none because, and I'll get into the explanation as of why. Oklahoma has a chance. It's that big as a swap between Oklahoma and the Clippers, and the Rockets get the worst out of those two, and they get to swap that with the Bucks pick. And right now, looking at the standings, OKC is currently a play-in team, or just outside the play-in with 27 wins, and the Clippers have 31 wins, and they're inside the play-in. The only way the top 6 versus top 9 would matter would be if the Clippers fell all the way to 9, which is probably not going to happen.
Right.
It would be a fall of, 7 games in 25 that are left, or something close to it. That's just not going to happen. And either that, or if one of OKC, or if the Clippers jumped up and OKC didn't jump up.
Right.
Wait, No, I'm not correct. If Oklahoma City jumped up and the Clippers jumped up, because if the OKC didn't jump up, they would just swap it. So the protection only kicks in if both OKC and the Clippers win the lottery, which is, looking at their current standings, is astronomically unlikely.
Right.
And the last point I'll make on this is, and I guess I have another one about the Feds, but if we look at the standings, the Clippers have 31 wins. There's an insane amount of teams within striking distance. If we narrow it down to teams that are within,
upside than downside, honestly, at this point when you look at the standings.
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. If you look at 31 wins, right, the teams right ahead of the Clippers are Phoenix, who just got a lot stronger with KD. It's Dallas, who just got a lot stronger with Kyrie Irving. It's Miami, which is kind of iffy. Yep. And then it's the Kings, but I think the Kings are just clearly a better team at this point than the Clippers are. And so you have, within 4 games backwards, towards the bottom of the standings, you have the Warriors, the Pelicans, the Hawks, the Timberwolves, the Jazz, OKC themselves, and Portland. And so there's a world where they can fall back as far as pick 11, for example. And pick 11 would be a damn good asset. It'd be a trade up of what, 18 spots in the first round. That would cost you
huge.
that would cost you a lot. We mentioned this last year when we were trying to think of scenarios of trading pick 17 and pick 24 at the time to move up into a range to draft our reason who ended up falling. That would be a huge shift in just in the standings. And then from the perspective of the guys that they actually got back, just a shout out to them getting back John Wall. That was just hilarious. Everybody got their memes off.
Apparently, you get to wave John Wall one more time. You get to list him as out one more time.
Yeah, and I can already imagine the call between. I wonder if that even was a call. I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet it was just a text, like just text saying, "Don't even get on the plane. You're out."
Yeah, come on,
something
guys,
like that. Yeah, it's just let's not even engage here. And then they also got Danny Green, who I would love to keep as a vet. I would even be willing to give him a role and take some minutes away from young guys. To if that's what it takes for him to stay. Maybe he looks at it as an opportunity to rebuild his trade value ahead of free agency. He's an impending free agent. And my read based on what Rafael Stone said is that he's going to report to the Rockets. He might spend a few days here, and they'll try to convince him to stay. And if he's willing to stay, that they'll keep him. But if he wants to leave, they'll also, just let him leave and let him go to a contender because that just fosters good relationships with his agent ahead of a really important free agency window. And if you look at who Danny Green's agent is, it's for example the agent that represents LaMelo Ball. So that's another guy that you might want, in the future.
Consider the relationship as the biggest priority.
Yeah, and so I guess that's basically it on the Eric Gordon thing. I don't have any more angles.
And I'll say we'll transition here as we wrap up the podcast to the Atlanta trade. Garrison Matthews, Bruno Fernando, and well, I suppose that's it because you end up getting Justin Holiday, Frank Kaminsky, and a couple of second-round picks from the Hawks. Well, actually from the Thunder. They're just being transferred from the Hawks because the Hawks own those picks. It's important to note from the Thunder because 2024 and 2025 second-round picks from OKC should actually be pretty decent. So it's not like you got the bottom of the order where you're likely to have, say, undrafted guys or guys that might go undrafted if you don't pick them. No, this is the range in which you could get legitimate assets. Even though the Thunder are overachieving this year, I don't think anybody expects them to be anywhere near contention in 2024 or 2025. And in that trade, you got Justin Holiday and Frank Kaminsky. In the EG trade, you got Danny Green, as you were talking about. And I don't want to downplay those players because they are accomplished veterans. But again, it remains to be seen who sticks around, although we should note that Justin Holiday and Frank Kaminsky were with the team in Miami. Danny Green was not yet. Perhaps that's a slight clue. But the bottom line is, in both cases, the incentive was the draft compensation. The players were just salary filler. All of them have expiring contracts after the season, so it doesn't impact your cap space. Rockets will have bird rights, I believe. But the bottom line is none of these guys are likely to be parts of your long-term future. Maybe Holiday and Green in particular could help you just because 3-and-D, wing defense, that's something you could use more of on this team, especially after losing Eric Gordon. But the bottom line is it's about the draft compensation and the EG trade. As we mentioned earlier, I think that speaks well to Rafael Stone. I think this Atlanta trade, certainly Rafael did a good job of negotiating. I think getting 2 second-round picks and decent second-round picks at that is a pretty good deal for ultimately what they took on. But I think honestly, a lot of it just comes down to Tilman Fertitta being willing to pay because this was a salary dump for the Hawks. Justin Holiday makes over $6 million a year, which is more than Bruno and Garrison combined. Then you add in Kaminsky as well. They're lowering their cap figure, their tax figure, and it's in many ways the same type of deal that the Rockets made for Derek Favors in the preseason, which got them a second-round pick from Oklahoma City. It's similar to the deal they made with Brooklyn in October 2021. It's not sexy, but it's Tilman Fertitta putting his money where his mouth is. I think they also spent some money to send some cash out to help facilitate it as well. And so the Rockets are doing the little things. I've got a rant on that in a minute, but I just think that in general, while I think this episode is very pro Rafael because it was a very good week for him, I think it was a good week for Tilman as well because this is another example of doing the little thing to get you a couple assets that you wouldn't otherwise have. This is ownership being willing to, go the extra mile. That's basically what this deal comes down to. It's nothing sexy, but, Garrison and Bruno weren't really playing. It also does open up, we should point out what limited minutes they were playing. Now you can evaluate Josh Christopher and Usman Garuba, your actual prospects, a bit more. So it may force Steven Silas's hand a bit, which it definitely did Friday in Miami. Those guys did get more minutes. But more than that, I mean, you're just taking on a greater salary and using that as an opportunity, as a vehicle to get a couple of decent second round picks. So, Rafael Stone saw the opportunity, he negotiated it, but also kudos to Tilman Fertitta for giving the green light.
Yeah, I think the deal is, well, on Tilman, I think most fans, while I do agree with you personally, just from interacting with the community, I think most fans are, they see that he's, doing these things, but what they truly want to see is when we're actually contending, if he'll be willing to go into the tax then, which, to be fair, usually, these when guys buy a team, the teams are not as good as the Rockets are right now, and it's hard to implement your own structure and your own people into the organization that you trust while the team's really good because you don't want to change what's working. And I think right now, I would guess that the organization has more people that Tilman actually trusts, and so I think he'll be willing to just go into the tax more and spend more, and as he's been doing so far. I think you can't complain, including that the Rockets have during their rebuild been close to not actually paying tax because that just doesn't make any sense for a rebuilding team, but they've been closer to the higher end of salary to the tax line than you'd expect a rebuilding team to do. If you look at the Thunder, they weren't even hitting the salary floor last year. The Pacers right now, before the milestone extension, weren't even hitting the salary floor. So usually rebuilding teams, even within what's below the tax, there's still a lot of wiggle room between the floor and what's close to the tax line. And the Rockets have been, I don't know where they are this year because I haven't paid attention as much because it just doesn't really make much sense from an analysis standpoint to pay attention to that. But the first 2 years they were fairly close, and we were discussing trades at the time and had to think about not going over the tax, which I think is pretty telling for a team that's the worst in the league.
Well, let me jump in here with my Tilman rant, and then I'll let you wrap up and any other thoughts you may have on the Hawks trade or anything else that materialized this week. I think the majority of the fan base gets it with Tilman Fertitta and understands the context. I think there's a small minority that, as you said, are just holding out bitterness from everything that happened in 2018 and 2019. And I think a lot of them, if they understood the context more appropriately, I think it would be easier to buy in on what they're trying to do now and be more optimistic about the future. Let's go back to when Tilman Fertitta bought the team in October of 2017. Everything that first year, from that point right up until Chris Paul's hamstring in Game 5 of the 2018 Western Conference Finals, everything they touched turned to gold. The success basically came too easy. Now then, over the ensuing offseason, there were 100% cost cuts, regardless of how they try and spin it. That's the truth. Everybody always loves to point to letting Trevor Ariza and Luc Mbah a Moute go, although I would point out that with Luc Mbah a Moute, and I heard this at the time, it was in large part based on medicals, and as it turned out, I mean, Luc Mbah a Moute was cooked. He never played a key role in the NBA again. So that actually was not cost-cutting. Now, you can argue that Trevor Ariza, which we didn't fully appreciate his departure at the time, because when he signed that 1 year, $15 million deal with Phoenix, which I'm sure they could have matched but chose not to, it was the same night the Rockets re-signed Chris Paul, so it was almost like a footnote. Oh, by the way, they let Trevor Ariza go. But ultimately, was there a hit? For sure. They would try to replace him on the cheap with James Ennis, Carmelo Anthony. Those guys were not as good. Ultimately, they traded for Iman Shumpert, who gave you some of what Ariza did, but even in mid-30s, Trevor Ariza, past his prime, still better than any of those guys. So yeah, it was a loss. And later in the offseason, they dealt away to get off of Ryan Anderson's contract, which now Ryan Anderson's overpaid deal was courtesy of Les Alexander, not Tilman Fertitta. But clearly he was over the hill and way overpaid. To offload that and reduce their potential cap/tax figure, they traded away DeAnthony Melton, the second-round rookie, who's turned out to be a very capable player, along with a future first-round pick, I believe, from 2019. So it was going to be very late in the first-round order. So for sure, they lost some assets in their bid to cut cost as well, and it had a negative impact on the court this coming season. However, where I draw the line with a lot of these people, they love to say that Tilman cost the Rockets a championship, and then basically paint him as responsible for turning a legit contender into the laughingstock they are now. And that, in my opinion, is way overplayed. Because the bottom line is, did he cost you a championship? Let's start there. The 2019 playoffs, when they lost in 6 games to the Warriors, the biggest difference by far in the 2018 series when they had the Warriors on the ropes right up until the hamstring versus 2019, that was just not the same version of Chris Paul. So I'll ask you, if you replace Iman Shumpert's minutes in that series with Trevor Ariza, do you think that flips the difference from the Rockets losing in 6 games to winning the series and then beating the Toronto Raptors with Kawhi as well? I personally don't. I think the much, much bigger factor was the regression from Chris Paul. Now, I'm not saying that just because it didn't cost you the championship that it's inconsequential. No, absolutely not. Those things did cost the Rockets both on the court, future assets, and so you can be upset about it. I'm just saying I think, it cost you a championship. I think that framing is what leads a lot of people to blow their angst out of proportion to the point where they struggle to even give credit where credit's due on moves like the Hawks trade and buying those 2 decent second-round picks. I think those moves in 2018, they hurt the Rockets. I don't think they cost them the championship. I think losing the 2019 championship was just based on not having the same version of Chris Paul that in 2018 was a top 10, worst case top 15 type player alongside James Harden. And then from there, after 2019, what happened to send you from being on the precipice to just a total teardown and rebuild? Obviously, the domino was the Russ trade. And so I've seen some ask the question, even though it's well reported that Harden asked for Russell Westbrook and made it clear that if the Rockets didn't make that move, that he would ask out. And I have seen some suggest, well, should the Rockets have traded Harden right then? I know it's easy to say that, but in practicality, Harden was the best player or close to it on the planet at the time. He's coming off the Unguardable tour, should have been back-to-back MVP. Tilman Fertitta would have gotten absolutely crushed if they tried to trade James Harden on the front end and go basically preventatively into a rebuild. That's just not realistic. I understand you can make a case for it, but in terms of practice, there's no way any owner is going to do that. I'm sorry. They had to do what it took. The only question is, if you hadn't had these cost-cutting moves, could you have kept James Harden from feeling that desperate? And to me, the answer is clearly no. If you had Trevor Ariza instead of Iman Shumpert, if you had DeAnthony Melton, if you had, a late first-round pick in 2019 or whatever type of veteran you could have traded that for, I do not think, as long as you still lose to the Warriors, which they did in 2019, James Harden is still going to be that desperate. He had all the power in the world. He was that great at that point in time. And guys like Trevor Ariza, a second-year prospect, and DeAnthony Melton, and whatever rookie you could get late in the 2019 first round are not going to move the needle in terms of what makes James Harden okay with the status quo. Clearly, the Russ trade is what led to the rebuild. It just made you assetless for the next few years. It clogged your cap books because Russ's salary is enormous. Obviously, he wasn't good enough as a player as well. All of those things are completely true. And it also led to this total teardown model because of all the future draft capital he gave to OKC. Then basically 2022 and 2023 were the only years that you completely owned your first round draft capital. So it heavily incentivized basically not just sort of trying to thread the needle and be relevant. No, you had to totally tear it down and try and maximize these 2 draft classes in particular. They ended up getting lucky in 2021 as well, thankfully, which led them to Jalen Green. But the bottom line is the Russ trade was the domino. I think most people agree based on the reporting that clearly Harden asked for it. The only thing you can pin on Tilman is, could you have prevented Harden from being that desperate if you had not cut costs to the extent they did in 2018? And my personal opinion is no. I just don't think when you actually look and not just talk abstractly, they cut costs, but what did those cost cuts actually cost them on the floor? I don't think the Ariza, Melton, the late 2019 pick is ultimately what you would need to salvage things with James Harden. I just don't think they're to that magnitude. So ultimately, I think you would be to the same place anyway. Now, with that said, would I like having DeAnthony Melton around? Absolutely. Would I like having whoever they hypothetically could have gotten in the end of the 2019 first round? Would I like to add that to the current rebuild? For sure. But I just don't see that being to the magnitude of, well, if you had those guys, it makes James Harden stay. So ultimately, in the big picture, the timeline is still the same. You're still in this identical place as an organization. So from a super macro perspective, oh my God! Oh my God! Sorry, we'll keep this in the podcast. Mizzou just hit a running three from 30 feet at the buzzer to beat number 6 Tennessee by 1.
Shut
Incredible.
up! No way.
The same player, you'll see this on Twitter. The same player who banked in a 3 from 35 feet at UCF in December. Just absolutely incredible. I cannot believe just a
Wait.
running 3 at the buzzer. 86-85. Mizzou 19-6. It basically punches their tournament ticket. What a damn win.
Let me give the context though, because that's fun. That's so funny the way the world works. Before the pod, we were recording. You know, for those who don't know, Ben's a massive Mizzou fan.
Yeah, I graduated from Mizzou.
Yeah, before the podcast, we were talking about how the game was going on. Now, and he was like, "I'm going to have to hold it back if Mizzou wins or if something crazy happens."
Well, the funny thing,
the chance, and I told Ben, just if it happens, just keep it in the pod. It's okay. The chance that it actually happened, insane.
Well, the hilarity is that I started recording. They were actually up by 17 early in the second half, and I said, actually, this is a good time to record because either they're going to hold the lead, or if they don't, then whatever. I'm not going to really want to pay attention anyway. So what ended up happening, they blew the 17-point lead, but then ended up rallying in the final minute and salvaging it anyway. And by the way, thank God he made it, because I'm watching the replay. It was actually very similar to the Eric Gordon, De'Aaron Fox, in which he got a bump on the shot. They just didn't call the foul. It just didn't matter because the shot went in. But yeah, if it had gone out, I would have been very salty after seeing the Rockets, lose that game on, them calling that little bump, that a similar bump on a shooter did not get called here. But whatever, what a shot. Anyway, let's circle back to finish the Tilman argument. You can be 100% bothered, and I would appreciate having those assets. It did hurt the Rockets, but I don't think it cost them a championship, and I don't think it sent them into this awful rebuild that, well, I guess it's not awful, but it just sucks to see all the losing. So when you look at it that way, I think it's much easier if you have the appropriate context to say, you know what, Tilman learned some hard lessons. Again, I think a lot of what happened early in the season, or early in his tenure, the moves came too easy. Success, basically everything they touched turned to gold. And I think they all believed that as long as they had Chris Paul on the floor in the 2019 playoffs, it would be fine and they would finish the job. And it wasn't. And I think they learned some lessons from that the success is not as easy as perhaps they thought it was when Tilman Fertitta first took over the team. And now they're doing the little things. They're going the extra mile to get those draft assets, to spend, not just the salary floor, but even when they're obviously not going to go into the tax now, maximizing your resources to try and put you in the best position possible for the future. They are doing the little things. And so I think it's much easier to appreciate it if you look at it as saying, hey, they did it a few years ago, but it wasn't anything catastrophic. They didn't quite get it. Now they get it. And if you don't look at Rockets ownership as sort of a cartoon villain, oh, this is the man who cost me a championship or totally destructed this team. If you look at it within the appropriate context, I think it's a lot easier to buy in on the fact that, hey, they get it now, and moves like this Atlanta deal, taking on salary yet again, should leave you more optimistic for the future. That's my rant, and apologies for getting it sidetracked by the Golston shot midway through.
No, that was awesome. Okay. Just you had your Tilman rant. I don't disagree with what you said. I still think it's fair that people are upset because when you're that close, and we know how it went without with those cost cutting moves. It's just fair. I think it's fair that people will always be upset about James Harden might be the best player we'll get in a long time, right? And just I get people's pessimism when it comes to what will happen once we get there again. Personally, I don't buy into it because I think if you've been willing to spend during a rebuild, I don't think you'll have a problem spending next time. I think he's learned the lesson. But to talk about the Garrison Matthews and Bruno Fernando trade and how that will impact the Rockets moving forward. I think it's a lot of people have been talking about moves around the margins, and after one of the second round picks was the Hawks dumping some salary. I think the other second round pick, as not reported this way, but Kelly Echo reported that the Atlanta Hawks had shown interest in Garrison Matthews before, and I don't think he's getting waived. And I would actually say that one of the second round picks that they got in that deal was actually for Garrison Matthews, because I think Matthews, considering his really cheap contract, team control, non-guaranteed, and the fact that every team has a use for a guy like Matthews, especially the good ones, I would say that that's an example of success of betting on a guy. He was on their G League team. They used their priority waiver claim from being the worst team in the league on him when he was coming out of the Celtics organization. I think that's a success story, and I think they deserve some credit for that. That being said, the biggest overarching point for me for this deal is it opens up minutes, and this deal and the Eric Gordon deal, just a massive amount of minutes just opened up. I think Matthews was playing something like 15 minutes a game. I think Bruno Fernando, as we all know, was playing 10 to 12 ahead of Usman Garuba.
Yeah.
When they were doing the weird 3-center rotation. Well, I think that's gone unless they play Kaminsky at which point I'm just like, okay. And I think that's the biggest angle, because development minutes for a rebuilding team are gold. That's you like first round picks, you like prospects, but you need to play these guys for them to follow through on their talent. And I think it'll be interesting to see how Siemens House deploys the rotation moving forward. We've seen one game of it, and I was interested. It wasn't the same patterns that we're used to seeing. We saw the backup to Jalen and Keshante, who started at point guard and shooting guard. We saw them rotate a little bit. Usually, the way the Rockets did things was when Jalen sits, someone comes to replace Jalen, and there's basically a new unit, and they switch a couple of the wings first, but then it's a whole new unit that comes on the floor. And they swapped around between Nick, Ty, and Josh Christopher quite a bit, and I thought that was interesting. We finally saw a rotation that was strictly young guys, and to me that's fun. That means that every shot, every miss, every rebound, every assist, every steal is coming from a young guy. So every play is exciting. Personally, and I know this is an unpopular take. Personally, I did not care for any possession where Eric Gordon took a shot during the last 3 years, unless it was passed to by Jalen or Sengun or something like that. And it's exciting to be invested into every possession.
Yeah.
And then besides that, I hope Kaminsky doesn't play. I hope Holiday would be okay with playing if it is as a way to enforce accountability. If the guy that's playing ahead of him is not doing well and he's not showing the effort, then I'm okay. Okay, play Holiday. Show Josh Christopher, Jalen Green, or whoever it is that's playing that role. Show them that they need to put that effort in, otherwise they'll be replaced in rotation and lose their minutes. But I also think that, and just in Holiday in specific, since he's already with the team, I think there's some potential there as a more vocal vet. He comes from a family, the Holiday family is very notable in the NBA. They have Drew, they have Justin, they have Aaron Holiday, who I think is also on the Hawks. Andrew Suka, I'm not sure if he's ever been on the pod, but he's someone I enjoy. I usually disagree with, but I enjoy his takes on Twitter. He tweeted out yesterday that he saw Justin Holiday coaching up Jalen Green on the bench after he came out during the game. Eric Gordon's not doing that, and Eric Gordon's a much better player. You can argue that. You don't even have to argue that, but Eric Gordon's not doing that. And we need guys that will do that. John Wall would do that. I remember several clips of him doing so. Hey, Justin Holiday is just your normal, 3-and-D guy, not the most talented guy. I don't think he's made more than $10 million a year a single time in his career. But if he can come in and if he can, help hold these players accountable, or if he has one tip for Jalen Green that helps him break through anything in this game, it's already worth it.
It's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so,
yeah, I was just going to say, as we wind down, I'll just point out that it's one game. We'll talk more about the micro next week when we get to the All-Star break, and we'll evaluate this 3-game road trip post EG trade. But we talked a lot this year about Gordon not being as dialed in defensively. And of course, he's not a rebounder. His lack of height makes them undersized a lot, especially when he's playing in a 3-guard lineup. And I know Miami wasn't at their best, but To me, that was the best the Rockets looked defensively all season long. They looked dialed in. They competed hard. I know it was a heartbreaking loss on the Butler lob at the buzzer, but collectively, they looked as in sync as I have seen them all year in that game against the Heat. And again, it's a small sample. Maybe that changes in Philly and OKC. We'll have to see. Oh, by the way, one last note before we close out. I was just going to say that certainly it speaks well to the idea that, yeah, maybe this is a better mix, and maybe, Holiday, whether he plays or not, is a bit better fit for what they're trying to do. And maybe they rally around this, especially defensively, now that they're fully bought in and all in sort of age alignment, rowing in the same way. But to bring it full circle, the Nets actually just lost to the Sixers, scored only 16 points in the fourth quarter to lose that game. And, I didn't watch the game because, of course, I was watching Mizzou, Tennessee. But to me, that reeks of a team without a star. They kept it going for 3 quarters, but ultimately just did not have enough offense against James Harden and Joel Embiid down the stretch. And
they were up by 7 points with 6 minutes to go,
and they just could not buy a bucket. And that's going to happen a lot. They're going to be an ultimate try-hard team, but then when the chips are down, especially against good opponents, and you need to get a bucket and it gets sticky in the half court, who's going to get it?
Dinwiddie's gonna get it. He got a total. Well, they got a total of 2 points in the last 6 minutes of the game. That's insane.
Yeah, but I think just to bring it full circle, yeah, that's where not having a guy like Durant really, really hurts you, and that's why, of course, the upside for the Rockets and those draft assets is considerably improved. Anyway, with that, we can bring this sort of disjointed episode to a close. I know we bounced around on a lot of topics, but I think we covered some good ground, recapping basically the 2 trades that the Rockets made and also the implications of everything related to KD and the Nets. Paolo, that's everything from my end. Is there anything else that you wanted to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I will manifest Jet Howard with the Clippers pick if they fall as a little bit further. And I will manifest Patrick Beverley to the Rockets as a vet presence and as a backup point guard.
I'll manifest DeAndre Golston to the Rockets. That's the kid from Mizzou that makes every damn shot at the buzzer. He actually has an NBA body, so he could work his way into being a second-round pick. But yeah, being a first-round guy, probably a bit unlikely at this point. But yeah, if the Rockets end up buying a second, DeAndre Golston has given me some impressive memories. So I'm going to try and manifest this on this beautiful Saturday night as we wind down. Anyway, with that, we'll finally adjourn. For Paolo, I'm Ben. If you want more content for our next episode, the best way to get it is on Twitter. Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. You should also follow our sponsors over at Karbach Brewing. That's their Twitter handle. And of course, they produce Clutch City Lager, their beer in collaboration with the Houston Rockets, this being the lager line. Of course, that's named after Clutch City Lager. So we thank Karbach for their support. I want to thank our friends at Sports Talk 790 as well. Follow them at Sports Talk 790 on Twitter. Listen to their content at sports790.com. Matt Thomas, 12 to 3 every day, Houston time from Monday through Friday. He's talking lots of Rockets. Of course, he's the radio play-by-play voice of the team, so he's got great interviews. Steven Silas and lots of other people around the team. So again, Sports 790 or Sports Talk 790, on Twitter, sports790.com. That's how you can access their content as well. Also visit our link tree. You go to the Logger line on Twitter and you can hit up our link tree. That's where you can find basically all of our various distributors, all information about basically where you can find the pod, but also our friends and partners over at Karbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire. You can find all of it through our link tree simply by going to the Logger line on Twitter. And as mentioned earlier, I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. With those plugs out of the way, we will break. For Paolo, I'm Ben. As always, thank you guys for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of the Logger Line.